Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This screen isn't on yet. I'll start telling stories while we're waiting. So this morning I'm going to be talking about keto and paleo diets. And I can remember first becoming really aware of these diets probably about 10 years ago, especially the paleo diet about 10 years ago, because at the gym I was going to, it was the diet everybody was on. I think every single fitness instructor at the gym was doing paleo. And I can also remember when keto started to gain some favor in the, we saw more and more people switching to keto, and I see people at the gym all the time on the keto diet. And I can also remember one of my very favorite instructors, probably about 5 years after he started paleo, switching to a more plant-based diet. And he told me that the reason he was making the switch was because so many of his colleagues had several of the most well-known leaders in the fitness world had developed cancer. And I thought that was so interesting. And so he said, and they shared this book that they're starting to use, and it was called How Not to Die. Of course, I got a big smile on my face. I thought, isn't that interesting? So they were starting to understand that there was a connection between what they were eating and the risk of these chronic diseases. So I thought to myself, it concerned me to see so many people moving in the direction of a more meat-heavy diet, especially in the early days of paleo. And so I thought I need to learn more about this and find out enough to be able to talk with some authority on the subject. And so that's why I'm going to be talking about that today. And so I'm going to just give you a little bit of an outline. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a little bit about the history of low carbohydrate diet. So we're talking about keto and paleo, which are kind of the two extremes of low carbohydrate diets. So we'll talk a little bit about the history. Then I will define keto and paleo diets, talk a little bit about the similarities and the differences between these types of diets. Then we'll dig a little deeper into some of the claims that are made by both camps, the keto and paleo camps. And then we'll compare a little bit about plant-based versus low-carb diets and how people do long-term on these diets. And we'll finish off talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of low carbohydrate diets. So a little bit about the history, and this is just a couple of slides, I think maybe 3 slides that goes through the timeline of the beginnings of these diets. And so ketogenic diets, we started using them in the 1800s to treat type 1 diabetes. And this made a lot of sense because at that time, of course, there was no insulin. So diabetes was a death sentence in fairly short order. And so a ketogenic diet would provide an alternative fuel for people that couldn't use sugar. And then in 1921, ketogenic diets began to be used to treat epilepsy. And the way that happened was there was some evidence that fasting could help reduce epileptic seizures. And of course, fasting causes ketosis. And so, because you start to use your body stores and you produce this other energy source. And so the thinking was, well, we can't obviously starve these little kids who have epilepsy, but could there be another way of producing ketosis to reduce epilepsy? And so that's how they started using these diets back in 1921. And then in 1958, we started to see interest in using ketogenic diets for weight loss. And there was a book that came out, or not ketogenic here, it was just a low carb diet for weight loss. And this was a a weight loss book back in 1958. And then the reason I put this one on is I just thought it was really funny. It's a low carbohydrate, up to 60 grams of carbohydrate, which is like 2 apples a day. That's it. That's all the carbs you'd be allowed. And daily alcohol. So it was called the drinking man's diet. And I know, it's kind of funny. And then in 1967, many of you may remember this, I sure do, but it was the Stillman diet, another low-carb diet. And then in 72, really, we had the release of the book that launched the low-carb craze, and that was the Dr. Atkins diet revolution, and everybody knows about Dr. Atkins. And then in 1975, the first kind of paleo-style diet appeared, and it was called the Stone Age diet. And then in 78, the Scarsdale diet, another low-carb diet. And then in 92, Atkins revised his stuff a little with the Dr. Atkins new diet revolution. And then in 2002, the sort of king of paleo, Dr. Lauren Cordain, put out his book called The Paleo Diet. And that made paleo quite popular. And then in 2003, the South Beach, and then all of the books and articles by Gary Taubes. And then in 2013, the Paleo Diet actually reached #1 in Google search as the most popular diet. And then in 2018, Keto Diets actually snatched the crown and became #1 in the search for the most popular diet. So they're the reigning king. So what is a ketogenic diet? Well, it's basically a diet that forces your body to shift away from using glucose as the primary fuel to using more ketones. And so why does the body shift? Well, #1 could be starvation, fasting, or very severe food restriction. So you're eating either nothing or maybe 600 or 800 calories a day, and your body needs to find some other form of fuel. So it relies on ketones. And the second thing that can cause the shift is a diet that's mostly fat. So you're not getting enough carbohydrates to fuel your body. So your body has to shift over to using something else. And so it starts to use ketones. So what are ketones? Well, ketones are the acids that are produced by the liver from fatty acids. So instead of using carbohydrate, you're using fat. And when you use fat, first of all, we constantly produce ketones. Everybody produces ketones. They're in our bodies all the time, but in very tiny amounts. We use it as a small bit of our total fuel. When you're deprived of glucose, however, your body's ketone production just ramps up, and you reach a metabolic state called ketosis, meaning that you're using a lot of ketones. So does ketosis equal ketoacidosis? Many people get the two confused. And in fact, in ketosis, the amount of ketones in your blood is higher than normal, but it's not high enough to cause acidosis. In ketoacidosis, and remember, ketones are acidic, okay? So they're acidic. When in ketoacidosis, the ketones go so high that it causes your blood levels of acids, of acidic ketones, to be so high that it's dangerous to your life. And in fact, people who develop ketoacidosis, about 2 to 5% actually die. So, and it's most common in type 1 diabetics who don't give themselves their insulin injections. Okay, and so that your body levels of ketones just go through the roof. But we've also seen, interestingly, some case studies of women who are lactating, so they're breastfeeding, so their energy needs are really high. They go on a super low carb or ketogenic diet and actually go into ketoacidosis. So that can happen as well. That's more rare. Most ketoacidosis is in people who have type 1 diabetes. So is ketosis, now we know ketoacidosis is not safe, But is ketosis safe? Well, it's generally thought to be relatively safe in the short term, but I think it can have some fairly negative consequences in the long term, and we'll talk later about some of those. But just as an example, think about your body being acidic for an extended period of time. Your body has to buffer the acid. And of course, we have this amazing storehouse of buffer called our skeleton. And so we use the calcium from our skeleton as a buffer for the acid. So long term, it could actually injure our bones. So how long does it take for the body to shift from using glucose to using ketones? Well, it usually takes about 1 to 3 days of not eating, like fasting, or eating a very low carbohydrate diet. First, what happens is we use up our stores of sugar, which are called glycogen. Then once our glycogen stores are gone, we make glucose via a process called gluconeogenesis. So genesis is the generation, neo is new, and then gluco for glucose. So creating new glucose. And what do we use to create glucose? Well, when we break down fatty acids in triglyceride form, part of that molecule is a glycerol backbone, which we can use to make glucose. We can use lactate, which is byproduct of glucose metabolism, to make glucose. We can even use certain amino acids to make glucose. So we have a number of things we can use to do this process of gluconeogenesis. And then as glucose reserves are depleted, the body just ramps up the ketone production as well. So can all our cells, and this is really important, can all the cells in the body use ketones? The answer is absolutely not. So up to 50% of our basal energy needs and up to 70% of our brain energy needs can be supplied by ketones. However, the balance will still have to come from glucose. Now, the other thing to know is that cells need two things to be able to use ketones. They need mitochondria, and they need certain enzymes for the process of producing ketones. Some cells actually don't have them. And one of the types of cells that doesn't have them is red blood cells. Red blood cells actually lack mitochondria. They must have glucose or they will not survive. That's their energy source. And the other is, surprisingly, our liver cells lack the necessary enzymes for the conversion. So liver cells can't use ketones for energy either. Those cells absolutely must have glucose. So are there any physiological benefits to ketosis? Well, in fact, there are. And particularly, we have a number of studies looking at using fasting or modified fasting, such as the fasting mimicking diet. And they've reported fairly favorable effects like reduced blood pressure, cholesterol, blood glucose levels. Well, of course, when you're not eating, you get those kinds of results. But this is the one that I think is most interesting. When you're fasting, your body's trying to survive. So it gets rid of deranged cells that aren't working properly, that could be cancerous even. It just tries to get rid of those cells. And something happens that your stem cells actually get boosted, and growth of new cells starts to occur, which can be very, very healing in some cases. So that's important. Of course, you get weight loss and you get reduced visceral fat and you get lower IGF-1 levels as well, which, as you know, can cause the growth of sometimes unwanted cells. And so these are, we also get reduced inflammation. And so you've heard, if you've heard about True North, for example, and some of these places that use fasting therapeutically, they have really quite wonderful success. So there may be benefits in those regards. But our focus today is going to be on high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets. And these diets, and they're producing ketosis, and is that good or bad, and why or why not? So the keto diet has really become just wildly popular as a weight loss diet, and it's gaining ground as a diet that could be used therapeutically to treat disease. So we're going to address those. So let's look now at the macronutrients in a keto diet. This is a keto weight loss diet. So it's generally about 75% of calories from fat, about 20% protein, and about 5% carbohydrate or less. So you can see it's very, very low in carbohydrates. And we see a range. So, it can go up to 80% of calories from fat and a little less in protein. But what really sticks, no matter what, is it is not more than 5% of calories from carbohydrates. Now, this is the classic ketogenic diet that was used for epilepsy and still is used for epilepsy. It's 90% fat, only 6 to 8% protein, and only 2 to 4% carbohydrate. Okay, so this is a diet that is extremely high in fat and low in both protein and carbohydrate. So it's stricter than the ketogenic weight loss diet. It would produce more ketones than what the weight loss diet would. So what foods are actually permitted on this diet? Well, you can see the base of the pyramid is meat, poultry, and fish, then eggs and dairy, then fats and oils, and then green vegetables and some non-green, non-starchy vegetables. And then at the top, you've got a few nuts and seeds and berries. What's not allowed, as you can see, is all the high carbohydrate foods like bread and pasta and sugar and fluid milk. I mean, they do allow dairy, but it's the high fat dairy like cheese and cream and butter. And no corn or beans or rice or any of the any of the starchy vegetables either. And the basic, theme would be eat fat, eat meat, poultry, eggs, and fish. The fattier, the better. And eat non-starchy vegetables. So that's kind of the diet in a sentence. Here's a sample recipe to give you a flavor. I got this from one of the popular keto websites. And you can see here, this recipe has 3 pounds of fatty ground beef, 2 cups of pepper jack cheese, 4 cups of Colby and Monterey jack cheese, and then 2 cups of frozen pepper strips. And that's it. So 1/8 of the recipe has almost 800 calories, 61 grams of fat, or about 70% of calories from fat, 30 grams of saturated fat, 7 grams of cholesterol, of carbohydrate, 49 grams of protein, 205 milligrams of cholesterol, and less than half of a gram of fiber. So there's almost no fiber there at all. So let's look at the paleo diet and how it compares to this. So the paleo diet is essentially a pattern of eating that attempts to mimic the diet of our Paleolithic ancestors. Other names you see are caveman diet, Stone Age diet, primal diet. And the basic premise is that what humans ate in pre-agricultural times is the diet best suited to our genetic makeup. The shift from a hunting, gathering diet, rich in wild meat and wild plants, to an agricultural diet rich in grains and legumes gave rise to our obesity and chronic disease epidemics. So that's what's believed in the paleo world. So what do the paleo macronutrients look like? Well, it's about 50% fat, about 30% protein, and about 20% carbohydrate. So it's a low carbohydrate diet, but not nearly as low as the ketogenic diet. So what foods are permitted? Well, you can see it looks really similar to the keto diet pyramid. Here's meat at the bottom, then fruits and vegetables in the middle, and then nuts and berries at the top. And of course, there's no beans, there's no grains, one of the differences, of course, there's no dairy here as well. And here's a sample recipe. It's very similar. Half the recipe is 643 calories, 37 grams of fat, 54 of protein, so it's even higher in protein, but it's got more carbohydrate, about 24 grams, 147 milligrams of cholesterol, and it's got more fiber, about 8 grams. So let's compare the paleo and the keto diets. So the similarities are in blue, the differences are in pink here. So let's look at the similarities first. Meat, poultry, fish, and eggs are high in both of these diets. Nuts and seeds are included in both diets. Green vegetables are included in both diets. Legumes are excluded in both diets. Grains are excluded in both diets. Okay, so here's the differences. So in the paleo diet, there is no dairy, whereas in the keto diet, there's quite a bit of dairy, mostly cheese and very high-fat dairy products. Other non-starchy vegetables are included in the paleo diet pretty generously, and they're included but limited in the keto diet, which I'll show you in a minute. Starchy vegetables are limited in paleo and they're excluded in keto. There are no potatoes or squash or any of those kinds of vegetables in a keto diet, but in a paleo diet, they'll fit in a sweet potato here or there, something like that. And then fruits are moderate in the paleo diet and they're minimized in a keto diet because they have a lot of carbohydrates. And then concentrated fats and oils are fairly moderate in a paleo diet and they are extremely high in a keto diet. So again, the macronutrients in keto, about 75% fat, 20% protein, 5% carbohydrate, whereas paleo is 50% fat, 30 protein, 20 carbohydrate. So let's talk a little bit about the carbohydrate restriction and what we're really talking about here. So a keto diet is less than 5% of calories from carbohydrate. Other low-carb diets are about 6 to 20% of calories from carbohydrates. So paleo is actually at the highest end of low-carb diets, whereas keto is at the lowest end of the range of low-carb diets. So how many grams of carbohydrates are we talking about? Well, keto diets are 20 grams for most keto diets. Some will go as high as 30 grams, but it's usually they try to keep the lid at 20 grams. So they try to eat less than 20 grams of carbohydrate. Whereas for paleo, it's about 100 grams. So it's much more generous. So let's take a look at the percentage of calories from carbohydrates in plant foods. So fruits are about 92%, starchy vegetables about 90%, legumes about 70%, non-starchy vegetables about 60%, 58% or so, and nuts and seeds are about 12%. Okay, so think about these numbers and then remember a keto diet is less than 5% of calories from carbohydrates and a paleo about 20%. Well, the vast majority of plant foods range from about 60 to about 90% of calories from carbohydrates. How many of those foods can they afford to eat if they're trying to get less than 5% or even less than 20% of calories from carbohydrates? Not a whole heck of a lot. So we really need to understand that plant foods are predominantly carbohydrates, with one exception, and that exception is nuts and seeds. That's where we get our essential fats from. Okay, and otherwise, they are predominantly carbohydrate. So how much carbohydrate in non-starchy vegetables? So a lot of people say, oh, keto diets, we can have lots of non-starchy vegetables. But if you look at it, an avocado has 12 grams of carbohydrate. If you're only allowed 20 grams of carbohydrate for the day, how many avocados can you have? Maybe one. Turnips, 12 for a cup. Brussels sprouts, 11 for a cup. And then we've got sort of the medium non-starchy vegetables like eggplant, cabbage, carrots, asparagus, broccoli, peppers, with somewhere between 6 and 9. And then the lower carb vegetables like the leafy greens, which might only have 1 gram of carbohydrate per cup. So you could eat more of those, but you certainly couldn't eat a lot of the other non-starchy vegetables, just so you know that there really is a limit on how much they can consume. Now, if you look at the carbohydrate content of other foods, and remember the lid is 20 grams for a keto diet, take a look at any of the grains or starchy vegetables. A serving of a cup of granola is 66 grams of carbohydrate. A bagel is 56. A cup of beans is 40. One apple is 30. The limit for keto diet is 20. These people, honestly, I heard somebody at the gym the other day say, I just realized how bad apples are for me. Can you imagine? And so this is the thinking, that these foods are bad because there's this black and white thinking. If a food contains carbohydrates, it's bad. If it doesn't, it's good. So that's the thinking. So what are they eating? Well, they're eating a lot of this stuff down at the bottom of this chart here. They're eating cream cheese, sour cream, cheese, butter, meat, chicken, fish, eggs. Those are the things that don't have carbohydrate. So by definition, this diet is a diet of this stuff. Okay, so just so you get that. So which is more healthful, a keto diet or a paleo diet? Well, a paleo diet is definitely healthier than a keto diet because a keto diet is the most extreme of low-carb diets. It's mainly fat and meat. Plant foods are heavily restricted, whereas a paleo diet is the least extreme of the low-carb diets. It allows a much more liberal intake of plant foods, about 5 times more than a keto diet. So it has more of the protective nutrients that we need to protect our health, like fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and pre and probiotics and plant sterols and all of those things. It's about 5 times higher in a paleo than keto diet.